I just think I think from an objective standard, if it was a legitimate one, they would have brought more equipment. They would have brought more troops to that if that was an actual goal.
But you acknowledge that they didn't bring enough troops generally.
Even if they were overconfident, I still think it is an arrogant to a point. I don't think we should be delivering Abrams at the end of the year, the Bradley, stuff like that.
Triple the Abrams.
Cool.
Abrams, it would be like Oprah in Ukraine. Okay, you get an Abrams. You get an Abrams.
When are you signing up, bro?
When am I signing up? I mean, okay. I think this is.
I know you go out there. Look, you're going out there and you're doing good.
I don't know if this is the best.
But you're putting U.S. soldiers, sailors, and airmen at risk.
Am I?
Yes.
How am I putting American personnel at risk?
Because when you are advocating for America to put out military equipment to a country to help fuel a war, there is absolutely nothing that you can do to claim that they have no justification, that country has no justification to enter war against said country. And I have a problem with that. Do you genuinely believe that Russia's going to declare war on NATO or the United States?
If they can't, if they can't take Kyiv, how the fuck are they going to take Berlin? How are they going to take Warsaw?
I actually, when that was going on, the invasion with Kyiv and stuff, I was like, that's a distraction. Well, it was literally a distraction to move troops away from the eastern side.
The attack on Kyiv was not a feint. It doesn't make sense, because if it was a feint, then it wouldn't make sense for them to be running out of fuel like they did. If it was a feint, then you wouldn't be running out of fuel. You wouldn't be running out of food. You wouldn't have 40-mile-long convoys and VDV landings trying to take Hostomel Airport that
VDV was doing their drops way too fucking high. You don't drop at 5,000 feet. You drop at like 1,200 feet.
I never said that.
They made a lot of.
To be clear, I never said the VDV was stupendous. They made a ton of blunders. But the thing is,
they made tons.
Why would they make a 40-mile convoy that gets picked apart by Bayraktar drones and ambushes, resulting in tons and tons and casualties? Hell,
because Russia doesn't train properly. One thing the U.S. Army does properly.
You gotta let me finish. Mm-hmm. They also engaged in cleansing operations where they would go door to door, knocking on doors, finding people on a list, interrogating them, and then shooting them. That's the type of thing you do in order to try to deal with the idea that there might be an insurgency after the war. The idea that you're going out.
So Ukraine did that exact same thing, with the exception of shooting them. They would just imprison people. What they would call Russian dissidents. They went and did the exact same thing with police forces in the Donbass region and things like that.
This is not okay.
In fact, they've been doing that for years. So don't pretend like this shit ain't happening.
Okay,
because
Aircraft.
This
is such a pivot that I think Can I see your ankle to make sure it's not broken? So my point wasn't Russia detained people. Did you also know Ukraine did? My point is you don't go around and engaging in cleansing operations unless you think you're going to be there for a while, and so you need to go out and kill everybody that could be an insurgent in the future. They were engaging in cleansing operations in the Kyiv Oblast because they thought they were in the Kyiv Oblast to stay, and so that's why they had these lists.
Do you tell every soldier what's happening, what the plan is?
Well, not everything, no.
No, you don't. Look, I think honestly,
this is such coke.
I think.
I'm sorry.
Coke for what? I want Russia to fucking lose.
It feels like you don't know a lot about it, and you're coming to this gigantic conclusion, like almost like a Hoi 4 paradox player, like you're moving the chess pieces around mega smart.
I'm not there. I'm not there. But looking at what happens, looking at what I could see, it looked like a diversionary deal, and they just never practiced their logistics properly. That's one thing the U.S. Army and most Western armies practice tons of is logistics, because without fuel, bullets, and beans, armies don't march. And the Russians have not. In fact, their doctrine is slow moving because they base most of their movements on artillery and stuff like that.
Why did they try to encircle Kyiv? Why did they go from Kyiv? They didn't just attack Kyiv from one direction. They attacked Kyiv from multiple directions. They even went around the city of Mykolaiv to make a beeline for Kyiv because they wanted to encircle it quickly and then make the defenders surrender. They wouldn't be they wouldn't be doing VDV landings, they wouldn't be attempting encirclements, and they wouldn't be doing 40-mile long convoys if it was just a diversionary tactic to make way for conquests in the south. It was a genuine attempt to take the capital.
Where was the bulk of the forces sent, though? Was it around Kyiv or was it around the Eastern Front?
The reason it was around the Eastern Front is because the defenses have been built up on the Eastern Front for 8 to 9 years. They still haven't taken Avdiivka after over a year of fighting. That doesn't prove that it was a diversion.
So when you are invading, you have an attrition rate of about 8 to 1. So the invading force is going to lose on average 8 soldiers to every 1 soldier lost from the defending. The amount of forces that they accrued wasn't even enough to do an effective evasion. And that's just the reason
I never said the Russians were smart.
Well, so you're saying you think it was this. I'm telling you from a strategic look, sure, if they would have taken Kyiv, they'd have been cool. We win, blah, blah, blah. But I think that was more of a diversionary tactic to move troops from the eastern side to allow for the lines on the east to move easier. Because there is a fact of an attrition rate for invading forces. For Christ's sakes, you have military people, tons of articles and studies are put out on this stuff. Now, I'm not a strategist. I don't work with the Russians or anything like that, but looking at the minuscule force that they used, a combination of poor training, poor logistics, and stuff like that, they had no chance of ever taking Kyiv. It looked like more of a reason to have forces pulled off the eastern line to help defend Kyiv. What happened? They pulled forces off the eastern side to defend Kyiv. They defended Kyiv properly. And dude, there was only like 40,000 troops that they sent around Kyiv. That ain't shit.
So I feel this feels like somebody like this feels like I'm at a concert and somebody comes out on stage like Gigi Allen and he shits in his hand and throws it into the audience, and then someone's like,
I don't even know who that is.
Interesting artistic expression here. I think the true meaning of him throwing feces at us. That's what it feels like. I think you're assuming that the Russians were perfectly informed, rational actors when they made these decisions.
No, I'm not making that claim. I'm just saying that it doesn't make sense that it was a legitimate try to take Kyiv.
Well, that's because they were working. Sense. They were working on. Yeah, of course it doesn't make any sense. That's why nobody thought they would do it. But that's because they were working on incomplete information. From what I have been led to believe, and from what I have read, oligarchs aligned with the Kremlin in Ukraine told the Kremlin, "You come in here, the Ukrainians are going to love you. They're going to welcome you as a liberator. Fantastic. It's going to be great. It's going to be fantastic." Then Putin, the all-powerful man who could kill you like that, turns to his generals and says, how well is the military? Are they prepared for this? Are they going to say, no, actually, the military that I have been hired to organize is actually in shit shape. We don't have the resources if it's an extended conflict. I think it's going to be kind of difficult for him to have a completely informed, logical look at the war. Not to mention the fact that if it is true that it was just a diversion, they wouldn't be using VDV. They would not. They would be using the most throwawayable troops they possibly could for these 40-mile long convoys that were torn apart by Bayraktar drones, that were torn apart by ambushes. It doesn't make sense for them to waste so many resources, so many men, and such what looks like a genuine attempt to take the capital in this manner. They would have done it in a completely different way. I genuinely believe that they thought they could walk into the capital like they did in Crimea and just take it, and that nobody would resist them because they're mighty Russia. They got full of themselves, this isn't the first time the Russians have gotten full of themselves in the past in this type of a war, where they thought they really overestimated themselves and how well they're going to do. Hell, they've even done it over the territory of Ukraine in the past, like when it came to the Battle of Crimea, or we could talk about the Russo-Japanese War. So I think a lot of people are looking at Russian military strategy and they're trying to find a way where this all makes sense from this is actually a smart move and they were moving to do this or that, or, maybe this was all pre-planned in advance. After they fell back from Kyiv, they redeployed those forces east. And then there was the Kherson counteroffensive that was successful. Then the Kupiansk counteroffensive that was successful, deliberated over 50% of the territory that Russia controlled in the territory where they had now deployed all of these new troops. To me, seeing that happen is a clear indication as to why the Russians couldn't take Ukraine. They just did not have a competent enough military force and able to do it. But they overestimated themselves, and now they're paying the price for it.
Well, so I look at it. I look at it through a Western strategic lens.
That's the problem.
When I looked at it,
You were looking at it as a Westerner.
Maybe so maybe that is the problem. But I know that when the U.S. conducts diversionary deals, we don't send throwaway troops. We don't. In fact, we will send the 82nd to do that. We will send 75th Ranger Battalion. We'll send some of our best to do that because they are going to be limited in support. And so we want the best out there to make sure that the chances of them getting out is better. I mean, that's just strong military tactics.
If it was a diversionary tactic, why were they trying to attack Kiev from all these different angles? Like they encircle,
to make it look legit.
They encircle locations like Cherniv, and they just keep moving. They just keep going.
But they did it with such little people, with such a small amount of people, and that's where I have the problem.
That's why I think they overestimated their own ability.
You may be right there, but what makes sense militarily, from a military professional stance, that was more of a diversionary tactic, and they thought that they were good on logistics that they were not practiced on. And this isn't a cope because fuck Russia, just straight up. I believe every country has their sovereign right to exist, and you shouldn't invade a sovereign country. I want Ukraine to win, but when I look at what's going on and looking at the movements that have happened we're now over a year now into this invasion, the only thing that makes sense to me is the land bridge deal. Now, what they put out, the propaganda they put out, the rhetoric that they put out, that is grandstanding on the world stage. They're used car salesmen. They're going to say whatever they feel will make them look more justified in the international spotlight. But what they're actually doing tells more, in my opinion, with the winter that came in and the ultimate it wasn't halting of fighting, but it's basically gotten to a quagmire. And with the spring happening, it looks like the lines aren't moving very, very much right now, and that's because of the land conditions. I think right now Russia has had the season to dig in their defenses and stuff, and I think it's going to be a nasty, horrible slugfest. It's really going to get nasty, and I'm wondering how Ukraine is going to, because they need to isolate Crimea. They need to push a spearhead to the Azov Sea in order to cut off that land bridge, in order for any real success to happen at this point. Because if they do that, they actually have an opportunity to where they could actually take Crimea back if they were able to get enough people to participate. Which are they having trouble recruiting right now? I'm curious.
Are they having trouble recruiting? The basic trouble that the Ukrainians are going to run into is the fact that Russia is a gigantic country. They have many more people, and they just have more people they can recruit from. The Ukrainian government has more people they can recruit. There's definitely people who have not been recruited. I know many of them. And there's even, I know there was even a problem at one point where people were volunteering and they actually weren't able to get in. I don't think that's the issue anymore, but I still think there's more people they would recruit, and they're still making new units, new battalions right now and training them for what everybody assumes is going to be the Zaporozhye counteroffensive, the Zaporozhye to retake that territory like Mariupol in south. That seems to be the thing that I agree with largely, and I do agree with the general premise that if the war isn't settled in the next year or two, these positions are going to get so much more entrenched that the only way victory could come at that point would be just through like sheer attrition. The idea that the Russians have run out of good equipment, that they're all on like T-55, T-54, like old Soviet style 1950s tanks. They can't defend anymore against Western equipment, or it's just gonna become a stalemate ceasefire, and it's gonna be like that for years. And I would like to avoid that scenario at all costs. But something I want to ask you about this Kyiv feint. If what you're saying is true, that they assumed the majority of forces in the east in order to capture the Donbass, that they were not overestimating the Ukrainians, that the Kyiv offensive was a feint, then why is it that they also did not have enough forces in the Donbass to take the Donbass, and they still haven't taken it? Wouldn't it? Wouldn't it
underestimated?
Yes, exactly. But I think they underestimated Kyiv.
Ukrainian willing to fight.
That's what I'm thinking.
I mean, that's really
exactly okay. So
no.
Exactly, I think that they underestimated Ukraine's ability to fight for Kyiv, for all the country. They thought there'd be a lot more opposition to fighting. They thought that in the face of Russia, the mighty Russian Empire, they would all basically surrender, like what happened in Crimea in 2014, that there wouldn't be much of a Western response, just like there wasn't under Obama in 2014, and therefore the country would collapse. If it is true, what you're saying, that it was a feint because they would have sent more troops if it wasn't, because this could never succeed. Well, the troops they put in the east of the country wasn't enough troops, and it could never succeed because we're a year later and they still haven't captured Kramatorsk. They still haven't captured Bakhmut after fighting for 7 to 8 months. They still haven't captured Avdiivka, which is literally was on the border with their occupied territory at the start of this invasion, and they've lost over 50% of the territory that they've captured since February 24th. I think they overestimated themselves in every way, and and from what I remember of the Kyiv counteroffensive, most of the analysts seem to be saying that actually the troops in the Donbass were also in large part there to tie the bulk of the Ukrainian military down so they could not go to Kyiv and defend it from the people trying to capture it, because they wanted to behead the Ukrainian government. But then when Zelensky stayed behind and he showed will to fight, and the territorial defense started getting deployed in villages, and the ambushes came, and the Bayraktars came, and then the 5-day war became a 1 month, a 2 month, a 3 month war, and they ran out of fuel and food. Then they had no choice but to pull out because their 40-mile long convoy, a lot of guys, by the way, 40-mile long convoy, was getting torn apart by ambushes, explosions, all this stuff. I think it's much easy to explain this by just saying it was general Russian overconfidence over their ability to decapitate the Ukrainian government with quick airdrops and a quick attack at the capital. They overestimated themselves greatly. That's why I think they engage in cleansing operations to deal with the aftermath of after they take the capital.
Yeah, I just look at the amount of personnel that they put towards the operations, and I mean, I thought they were woefully undermanned for even the Eastern invasion. But
so they're undermanned for both, and they failed in both. So couldn't it just be they were undermanned for both?
I still think that the move on Kiev was more of a feint, because if you're going to divert troops, you're going to divert them more towards your capital than you would than the eastern side. I mean, what's more important to the country? Its existence through this head of government, or some areas that they've had rebels and everything else going on over a decade
this
now.
This is something that I think if you've only been if the war started on February 24th, then I think you might have an argument. But there are areas that were bordering the Russians at the start of this war that have been controlled by the Ukrainians for the entirety of this war. And that's in the east, the areas that the Russians have been trying to take for over the last year. So I think that indicates that the defenses that have been built up over the last 8 or 9 years are very strong, and therefore the Russians are going to need more soldiers to take that than to, for example, scare the capital out, to scare the government away. That was their assumption. And you got to remember, man, I think a lot of people underplay this. There are a lot of yes men who's going to tell Putin whatever the fuck he wants to hear. If somebody is going to take it's going to get a lot more positive response if you're an oligarch in Ukraine that's aligned with Russia to say, dude, the people are going to love you when you come in here. They're going to accept you. There'll be like a few rabble rousers, but the people truly are waiting for liberation from Western imperialism. And then it got to their head.
That's actually a big problem. So that's a big problem, the yes men type stuff. This has actually brought all kinds of issues here in America. The Challenger explosion was because of overconfidence and yes men type scenarios. When we looked at what happened with that tragedy, it was people, oh, the shuttle is so stable, blah blah blah. We blah blah blah, all these different problems. This isn't going to be big enough to cause any issues, and we ended up losing those astronauts. Complacency and the yes we can mentality against all odds is fucking stupid. Russia's made a lot of horrible moves in this campaign, and I think at this point I think the only thing that, even when it started, the only thing that made any strategic sense to me was taking the eastern side to build that land bridge, regardless of what they were saying. You know, and I think people who were calling to what's the river that they were saying that the eastern advance was going to stop at, and Ukraine should just give that up. I thought that was a stupid argument too. I think a lot of the
stupid
rhetoric,
argument, because when you look at the amount of land across that river that is still controlled by the Ukrainians, it's immense. Like, they still control like 90% of it.
Ukrainians have done a amazing work against a semi-professional army, and I can't call it a fully professional army because look at all the blunders they're making. Logistically, they can't keep their own supplies to their troops right now. There's even reports that on the Eastern Front that Russian soldiers are starving, or slowly starving, because they're not getting enough food and things to them. Their logistical supply trains fail. You saw that. You mentioned the 40-mile convoy. Hell, when they dropped the VDV around that airport in Kyiv, they dropped them too fucking high. Yeah. Things like that.
Can you explain that to me? Because in my mind, that is a risky landing at the very start of the war in order to capture an airport that can help them establish air superiority, which would make it so the Ukrainians going to have a hard time to defend themselves. Because that's something that people thought the Russians would establish in 24 hours. In fact, the Russians announced like 24 hours into it that they had destroyed the entirety of the Ukrainian Air Force. Really silly thing to establish, definitely when they hadn't even destroyed the majority of the Ukrainian Air Force. Most of it was safe in bases across the country. But they made that announcement, and they captured Hostomel thinking they could use it as a base of operations to not only ship more troops in, but also attack Kyiv. And then the landing failed, and it failed miserably. And then the slow slog followed. If it was just a feint, that landing doesn't make sense to me, because you're expending some of the most advanced troops to get absolutely humiliated in the first 24 hours of the war, while you're also announcing to your people that you've destroyed the entirety of the Ukrainian Air Force. It sounds like they were announcing to their people total and complete victory as that victory wasn't showing up, that they were preparing for total and complete victory, announcing total and complete victory. They had press statements ready for total and complete victory, and then it didn't come. It didn't happen.
Well, I mean, when the invasion happened, when they were when they were pushing the troops out the back of the planes, they were flying at around 5,000 feet, too high for an airborne invasion, by the way. You want to do that around 1,200 feet, so you have less time under a canopy. That's just, I don't know if that's a Russian doctrine. I know U.S. doctrine, we usually fly around 1,200 to 1,000 feet for static line deployments. And it's because of how long you stay in the air. You want less time in the air with minimal amount of time to allow for deceleration and stuff like that. The more time you're in the air, just more you're a target. And when they deployed those forces, they deployed them in very light. It really wasn't good real numbers. And if they were going to actually capture that airport, it would be as a staging ground to fly in more conventional troops and things like that. But calling the VDV, I mean, maybe some people will say that they're advanced. I wouldn't call them that. They're just airborne troops. What I think of a more advanced units.
They're supposed to be advanced, but then it's like, but the standards for what's advanced in the Russian military are different than what's advanced for another military.
But no, they screwed this one up from a logistical standard more than anything. And it's because maybe poor maintenance practices, maybe it's they don't practice, they didn't train. Movement of fuel.
I guess the main thing it's hard for me to wrap my mind around here is you seem to acknowledge that generally they just didn't deploy enough troops in the east to capture the east. But when I say like
they didn't deploy enough troops, period.
Anywhere. I mean, why can't it not?
Estimated 120. They estimated 120,000 soldiers.
It was like 190 to 200,000, something around that range.
Yeah, no, they needed around 3 to 400,000 just on one front. For the so if they really wanted to take Kyiv, they would need about a force of 200,000.
So for me, that indicates a general overconfidence that spread through the entirety of the invasion, what makes it very easy for me to believe that yes, they tried to take Kyiv. They took moves towards Kyiv from all directions. It makes it look like they're trying to take Kyiv, to doing landings, to try to take airports that can help them take Kyiv. They're announcing that they're about to take Kyiv on public TV as they talk about the complete decimation of the Ukrainian Air Force, and then it doesn't happen. For me, that just looks like they were generally all around overconfident in how they could decapitate the Ukrainian government, and they deal with the bulk of the most difficult positions to take in eastern Ukraine with the majority of their army. They were completely wrong on every level, but it just the feint just doesn't translate to me.
I just think I think from an objective standard, if it was a legitimate one, they would have brought more equipment. They would have brought more troops to that if that was an actual goal.
You acknowledge that they didn't bring enough troops generally.
Even if they were overconfident, I still think it is an arrogant to a point to go that ill prepared if it wasn't a feint.
Do you remember?
If it's a feint, it would make sense. It would make a little bit more sense how they did it.
Do you remember the Russian invasion of Chechnya, the first Russian invasion of Chechnya? How poorly that went for them. How they heavily overestimated how well this was going to go. How it was going to be showing that Russia still had its glory, no matter how many military budget cuts they did, no matter how corrupt the military was, no matter how many of their weapons are being sold out of the back of cars by these private military contractors that transport weapons, or by corrupt government officials. They went in, they got their ass kicked, and then they had to go in again a few years later after Putin was made president. I think this isn't even the first time Russia has gone into invasion of what is supposed to be ostensibly a much smaller country that they should be able to win a war with, and then they bungled it because they highly overestimated their own ability and highly underestimated the willingness of the people they were invading to fight. This is not even the first time they've done something like this.
Yeah, no, it's but I think the amount of which they have underestimated, I don't know if that's I don't know if that's just a pride thing. Something about it just doesn't work. And maybe it's because my training was with the Western Army. I'm trained on how we conduct our operations, what we know works, what we know doesn't work. I just know that on an international level, any military expert looking at how they built up, even a lot of the experts were saying this isn't a legitimate invasion. It's not one that's going to succeed just because they didn't put enough resources and personnel there in order to do it properly, because of the natural attrition rate of an invasion force versus a defending force, especially like there in the East where there's been constant fighting for over a decade at that point. And so there was already heavily built up defensible areas in Ukraine that has to go into the calculus of planning an invasion.
Okay, I actually have a gift to show you. This is from the VDV that was in the area. This is from a BMP 2K that they were using after the vehicle was exploded. The ammunition. Oh,
nice! I like that.
Went kaboom!
Yeah,
and
the case cooked off. Yeah,
the case cooked off, and a lot of the stuff that exploded in this area, a lot of the stuff that was destroyed, a lot of the locals collected, and a friend of mine made art out of it. Made art out of the destroyed Russian wreckage. And what he'll do is every single time there's a pro Russian commentator online, he'll post with the art. It's you like my art pieces? It's of these destroyed machines and equipment from the VDV in the area.
Yeah. See, I'm not pro-Russian though. I just
thought you would find it interesting. That's all.
Yeah, no, that's actually really cool. I have casings from
you got more?
Some AC-130s.
More fascist.
Oh snap! There's so much. Look at all this stuff. My goodness.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it is actually pretty cool. I love little historical artifacts like this. This is the type of stuff that people should show Ukrainian grandchildren in the future. Ukrainian.
Actually, I'm waiting for the Ukrainian farmer to bring out his own little T-72 that he stole off the line when they broke down.
They made it tax deductible. Did you know that? After so many tanks were captured, they made it tax deductible. I was looking at the numbers. I think there's possibly been more tanks captured than destroyed from the Russians. As in, due to those fuel shortages early on, during those retreats, they just had to abandon their tanks. And so many tanks were abandoned because they just ran out of fuel. But the thing is, and this is the problem with a lot of the Russian tank fleet, is there's so much armor. Russia is such an armor-heavy military. That's why they've lost so much armor, is because they use so much. But the problem is when you use a military of that size with that much armor, that takes up a lot of fuel. This is why a lot of vehicles in Western militaries are not as armored if they're support vehicles or if they're not going to see direct combat in most scenarios, because not only is it not as necessary, but they don't want to have an extremely fuel intensive military. And that's not always because, you know, you don't have the fuel. For example, Russia never considered this because they're like, we're Russia, we have the fuel. But getting the fuel to the troops is the problem. The logistics.
Their logistics is training. Their training and logistics is sad. And look, a lot of this is probably due to Soviet doctrine. We trained when we were, you know, when the U.S. military.
1 second. Somebody just told me Oryx has the numbers. It's more destroyed. I think it was more captured than destroyed earlier on in the war at one point because of how many they captured. But continue, sorry.
Well, so when we were training in Europe to defend Europe from Russian invasion, we basically focused on fast moving attacks. So air attacks, things like that. Russia, their entire doctrine was built on artillery, which is slow. Armor was supposed to be like the tip of the spear, but it was to rush in, grab an area, and then have artillery come set up, and then they would leapfrog like that. And that doesn't work. That doesn't work on a modern battlefield for the most part. Back in maybe in the Cold War days that would have worked, but because of the delays they would have between taking land and then moving the artillery forward, they would have natural leeway for movement of fuel and ammos and things like that would just come naturally. And I think they moved quicker than what they normally would have. And I don't know if it's because of lack of people and they want to hurry up and get it over with or what.
Well,
but
you mean the Russians move quicker than they usually would have. And that's the thing.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the difference in how we're analyzing this. I see that speed that they used where, for example, they just went around Mykolaiv. They tried to capture it. They failed. And so instead of encircling it and going into siege warfare, they decided to pass it and keep heading towards Kyiv. And when I see strategic decisions like that, which means giving up cities in the south of the country to head towards Kyiv, that sends the signal towards me, because you said that like this was, oh, hey, Oscar, how's it going? They said, hello, doggo. They said that, you said that this was, they wanted to capture the south. They wanted to establish a land bridge. Mykolaiv is an extremely important city for them to capture the top of that south. It's after Kherson. If they capture Mykolaiv, honestly, Kherson probably would not be liberated right now if they did end up actually capturing Mykolaiv. It would have taken a lot more work for the Ukrainians to do that.
Yeah,
but they avoided.
Kherson would have been cut off, right? It would have been like geographically cut off pretty bad.
It would have been a lot more isolated from the Ukrainians. It would have been much more difficult for them to retake it because they would have to take Mykolaiv first, and it would be easier for the Russians to take Odessa, which is something they really, really want, but could never attack because, once again, underestimated the Ukrainians and overestimated themselves. But as they say, those early days, they were just making beelines for Kyiv, which indicates it's an importance to me, but also that speed, I think, goes closer to what I was saying about what their plan was, which is the quick decapitation of the government, that they quickly go in, they capture the legislators, and they force them to abolish the government, just like they did in Crimea. Igor Girkin said in an interview that they literally held the Crimean legislators at gunpoint and forced them to dissolve the government. That's the former defense minister for the proxy state the Russians put up, the Donetsk People's Republic. So that signals to me that they wanted to quickly decapitate the government. They were going at it from multiple angles. They were going quickly, so they wanted to make it so the government didn't have enough time to respond, that the West didn't have enough time to respond and give them weapons, because they knew it would become a quagmire, which it now is once that plan has failed. So that's another reason why I really think that the feint just wasn't a feint. Their speed, I think, indicates that as well.
But very quick speed, especially with seeing what happened with the Blitzkrieg in World War II, because ultimately that was the biggest fault with the Blitzkrieg, was the fact that logistical supply lines couldn't keep up, and that was that really caused problems for the German forces. So when an army moves that fast, when they're moving faster than their logistical lines, that is usually that is usually done when they don't believe they're actually going to hold it. It shows more for distractionary than anything.
Well, I mean, I think that the Russians not learning the lessons they should from their wars is something that they've done before. Great example of this. We're stay with the Germans for a second in Blitzkrieg. The Tiger tank had a notoriously unreliable engine. People love the Tiger because it looks cool, and like the soldiers that manned them were the best of the best, usually of the German tank corps, and it is like a good tank in many ways, but its engine was dog doo-doo. It broke down a lot. It was not it was not the greatest. The Russians, yeah,
the problem with the Tiger, so the reason why a lot of people love the Tiger is because it almost seemed indestructible because of how heavily armored it was, the way the slopes were and everything. The problem with it wasn't that the engine itself was garbage, it's that it was so over-engineered, so overly complicated to maintain that the common tanker could not keep the maintenance up on that tank, which caused for high mechanical failures. The Tiger was actually designed with the idea that the mechanics would be able to be with them in close proximity, but Blitzkrieg took away that ability because they didn't have their practice of logistical supply lines.
But the engine broke down a lot, whether it was due to overcomplication. When
you have a lot of
it broke down a lot. It was not as reliable, for example, as the engine that the Russians were using at the time. The engine that they were using at the time is the engine that they actually still use for a decent chunk of its tank fleet, including the T-72. And this is a problem they tried to confront when they were building the T-14 Armada tank. But what they did is that they then went on to copy, literally like inch by inch, the Tiger engine that was notorious for breaking down, put it in the T-14 Armada, and there's a reason why we don't see them all over the battlefield right now, is in large part due to the fact that they built that tank around that shitty engine from the Tiger. Yeah. And so I think that the Russians a lot of times won't necessarily learn the correct lessons from warfare. They'll make the same mistakes like they did with the invasion and attempted decapitation of the government and going too fast, not consolidating. But that's because their goal wasn't to capture every single inch of Ukrainian territory like immediately. Their goal was to decapitate the government, cripple the government's response and their ability to resist them, and then they eventually just like surrender because there's nothing they can do because the government's gone. They have no ability to control the country. Which again, if you're saying that their main goal was taking southern cities, why did they go around Mykolaiv and start heading towards Kyiv if the goal was just to take southern cities and divert from Kyiv?
So that would have to be something we'll have to look back in history when there's actual chances to look at what the notes were on the strategies. I'm just going off of what I understand about warfare and everything else, what the training I've dealt with, just what I see, what makes sense to me strategically. I'm not thinking on a tactical level. I'm thinking on a more strategic, long-term level. But that's the difference
between you and the Russians, though. You're thinking on a strategic level where the Russians don't think.
Well, I can't say that. I've actually dealt with Russians through open skies treaties and things like that.
Okay, I'm not all Russians. Yeah. Just all the Russians in positions of power.
Anyway, no, I just one of the reasons why we use turbine engines in our armor is because of lessons learned from the German armor back in World War II. Turbines or jet engines, they're less moving parts, less things to break. They're actually more reliable than your traditional diesel engine. So like the M1 operates off of essentially a jet engine. It's a turbine that it runs on, not a traditional like diesel. But we also, one of the biggest differences is like when you look at, and the Russians pride themselves on how they destroyed the Third Reich. That's like a big thing to them. They destroyed the fascist. And that's something they pride themselves on. When we split up the technology, they took a lot of.
Well, can I just say they did defeat Hitler, but it is pretty weird how much the stand like they erased the first part where they're like, "Hey Hitler, we would love to split Poland in half."
Yeah.
And it's really interesting.
Turbine engines. Yes, that's what we mostly use in our M1s and stuff. it's really interesting. Yeah, they omit that part. Yeah, if it wasn't for Hitler saying, you know, screw you and going against their little treaty, yeah. Anyway,
I think it's time we probably wrap it up.